Dad texted, "Take off that uniform. You're embarrassing us." 5 words, 5 bullets. They hit harder than shrapnel ever did. The message lit up my phone as I stood behind the chapel doors, fingers resting on the polished brass of my dress whites. I should have expected it. Silence had always been his weapon of choice. But this wasn't silence. This was the final shot. The hallway smelled faintly of waxed wood and old hymnals sharp against the starch of my uniform. The ribbons across my chest caught the morning light seeping through stained glass fragments of red and blue scattering across the polished floor. 4 stars gleamed on my shoulders. Weight I had earned, 1 deployment, 1 scar, 1 life saved at a time. I should have slipped the phone into my pocket, ignored it. Instead, I stared at the glowing screen, my father's words burning into me like acid. Embarrassing. That's what he saw when he looked at me, when he thought of me. Not 4 stars. Not 25 years of service. Not the soldiers who walked because I had carried them. Just shame. On the other side of those doors, 200 Navy SEALs waited in their seats. Men I'd trained, commanded, bled with. In front of them, James, my groom, stood tall in a navy blue suit. A civilian, but one who understood me better than most in uniform ever did. He would be standing at ease, hands folded neatly the way he knew I preferred. He wasn't waiting for a bride in white lace. He was waiting for me, medals and scars included. Behind me, 2 of my oldest comrades flanked me like silent guardians. Marcus Hill, who once dragged me from the wreckage of a downed helo in Kandahar, still bore a limp that never fully healed. Torres, tough as iron, had lost a leg in Syria and still beat half his platoon on PT runs. They were supposed to sit in the pews. They refused, said they wouldn't let me walk alone. The text still glowed. "Take off that uniform." It wasn't the first time he'd tried to strip it from me, not with scissors or hands, but with silence, with words that sliced deeper than knives. The first time was when I was 18. Letter of acceptance to Annapolis, clutched in my trembling hands. He'd looked at me like I was a stranger, said, "Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." He hadn't spoken to me for a year. That was my father, Colonel Frank Holstead, retired 82nd Airborne Bronze Star Purple Heart. A man carved from regulation and granite. He had spent his life climbing from enlisted to officer, leading men through jungles and ambushes, and never let me forget I wasn't one of them. The phone buzzed again in my hand, a phantom echo, though no new message appeared. My pulse steadied. Not sadness, not anger, just clarity. Because I knew what waited when those doors opened. The organ's first note rumbled like distant thunder. Hill straightened at my left. Torres tapped his crutch once against the floor like a war drum. The chapel door swung wide and sunlight crashed across the aisle. I stepped forward, heels sharp against wood ribbons catching fire in the morning glow. A hush fell. Then a voice, steady commanding, rang out from the front. "Admiral on deck." The air snapped like a flag in the wind as 200 men rose in unison, every shoulder squared, every hand to brow, every chest lifted with pride. The sound of boots striking the floor in perfect rhythm shook through the chapel. I walked forward, spine straight, heart steady. My father's words still lingered on the phone in my pocket. Embarrassing. And yet, row after row of warriors who had bled beside me stood tall. Not because of protocol, not because they had to, but because they chose to. 200 SEALs saluted. Blood didn't salute. I didn't grow up in a house where "I love you" was spoken. I grew up in a house where shoes lined up at 45-degree angles were proof of love, where silence was considered strength, and where mistakes were met with lectures instead of comfort. My father, Colonel Frank Holstead, ruled our home like it was his barracks. The 82nd Airborne lived in his posture, in his clipped words, in the way he inspected a dinner table as though it were a rifle. He wasn't cruel, not in the way people usually mean when they say cruel. He didn't hit, didn't scream, but he carved silence into me with the precision of a bayonet. When I was 10, he took me to the Army-Navy game. Most kids screamed, waved banners, wore jerseys. I remember standing next to him on the concrete steps of the stadium, the roar of the crowd vibrating through my ribs. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He leaned down, pointed toward the cadets in their crisp whites, and said flatly, "You'll never wear those colors, kid. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." I didn't cry. Not there. Not ever. Not in front of him. Instead, I memorized the way the cadets stood their backs straight, their eyes unflinching. I imagined myself among them, shoulder to shoulder, my name stitched into history, whether he approved or not. At home, my mother tried to soften the edges. She taught literature at the high school, and her voice carried poetry the way his carried orders. She would slip me lines of Emily Dickinson before bed, whispering, "Hope is the thing with feathers." She called me her storm bird, wild, fierce, a little too strong for my own good. But my father's voice always thundered louder. I ironed his uniforms before I even had my driver's license, pressed the creases so sharp they could cut polished his shoes until my own reflection stared back at me. He said nothing when I handed them over. Silence was his approval. Silence was his love. At least, that's what I told myself then. When I turned 17, I filled out the application to the Naval Academy in secret. I wrote the essays late at night after finishing calculus homework, using the glow of a desk lamp while the rest of the house slept. When the acceptance letter arrived, I carried it into the living room like a peace offering, trembling, desperate for a smile. He stared at it for 30 long seconds. Then, without a word, he left the room. The silence stretched into weeks, then months. He canceled our Saturday breakfasts, skipped my graduation party, spoke only in clipped phrases about curfews or chores. I had been erased not with anger, but with absence. My mother tried to bridge the canyon. She bought me a small gold anchor on a chain, pressed it into my palm, and said, "Keep flying, Stormbird." But even her warmth couldn't fill the hollowness his silence left. At Annapolis, I carried that silence with me like contraband. While others carried their father's pride, I carried his rejection. I was determined to outlast it. If I couldn't win his approval, I'd survive without it. The academy didn't make it easy. A woman in uniform walked a razor's edge twice as sharp, half as fair. I learned to run faster, study longer, endure harder. Every mistake was amplified, every triumph minimized. I spent nights memorizing regulations by heart, knowing one slip would confirm every whispered doubt. Still, I rose. Slowly, painfully, one bar at a time. I wore blisters on my feet and bruises on my shoulders like armor. Each stripe stitched to my sleeve was another stone laid in the wall between me and his silence. And yet, I called him with every promotion. From plebe summer to ensign, from ensign to lieutenant. Every time the phone rang into nothing, I left voicemails that were never returned, words falling into a void. Eventually, I stopped calling. The silence had become louder than words ever could. But even as I closed that chapter, his shadow lingered. Every medal I pinned, on every salute I returned, every order I gave, I carried the echo of his voice. Leave the uniform to men. It didn't break me. It forged me. Years later, standing in that chapel with his text burning in my pocket, I realized the truth. I had been preparing for that moment since I was 10 years old, on a stadium step watching men in white march across a field. Blood had denied me, but honor had not. The Naval Academy was my crucible. It taught me how to take the silence I carried and hammer it into steel. On my first day, standing in formation under a brutal July sun, I could already hear the whispers. Not the shouted commands, those were easy, predictable, barked like rifle fire. The whispers came from the edges behind clipped salutes and sideways glances. She won't last. Quota fill. Too small, too soft. They didn't know me. They didn't know the house I'd grown up in, the man whose silence had been sharper than any drill instructor's scream. Compared to my father's wordless judgment, the insults rolled off like rain on brass. I ran harder, studied, longer, fought for every inch. I learned to anticipate failure before it arrived. If a male classmate needed 4 hours to master a maneuver, I spent 8. If someone else dropped to the floor after 50 push-ups, I pushed to 70. Pain was irrelevant. Doubt was irrelevant. What mattered was staying upright when others expected me to fall. There was one night during plebe summer that still echoes. We'd been running drills for hours, sweat cutting salt trails across our faces, bodies trembling with exhaustion. A senior officer looked down at me, eyes narrowed, and said, "You're still here." Surprising. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Where else would I be, sir?" He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The next morning, he called me Holstead instead of girl. That was enough. 4 years later, I walked across the stage in Annapolis Gold Bars, catching the light. No one from my family was in the stands. My mother was already gone lost to breast cancer during my second year. My father never showed, never wrote, never called. I pinned the bars to my collar alone, feeling the weight settle on me, not as burden, but as fuel. My first assignment dropped me into Okinawa. Paperwork, logistics, herding men twice my size who looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong room. They laughed behind my back, called me poster girl mascot quota. But when deadlines hit, it was my reports. They used my systems that kept supply lines moving like clockwork. Respect didn't come easy, but it came quietly, grudgingly, through competence. Then came Somalia. We were running a recon supply line when the ambush hit. The night was hot, the air thick with salt and rust. Gunfire tore through shipping containers like thunder cracking steel. One of my men went down leg-mangled blood soaking through sand in dark rivers. Technically, I wasn't required to move forward. My rank could have kept me behind radio in hand directing. But he was my man. And if I'd learned anything from silence, it was that absence is louder than action. So I went, crawled 40 yards under fire sand, biting into my elbows bullets, chewing holes around me. My hands locked on his webbing, dragging him one agonizing foot at a time. His screams rattled my teeth, but I kept moving. Tourniquet cinched with one hand, pressure with the other, voice calm even as my own blood ran hot from shrapnel in my side. By the time the medevac lifted him out, I was soaked in crimson, not all of it his. I refused the stretcher. I stood swaying but upright and ordered the rest of the team out. Later in the debrief, one of the younger sailors muttered, "She bleeds ice, not blood." The nickname stuck iceback. I hated it, but secretly, I understood. It wasn't ice, it was resolve, a refusal to collapse in the silence where others might. That sailor lived. Years later, I got a Christmas card from him. His daughter's name was Avery. He'd named her after me. After that command, started to notice. Not because I was loud, not because I chased medals, but because I endured. Every closed door, every doubt, every dismissal became another hinge I learned to pick. While others chased promotions, I chased excellence. When I finally pinned on Commander, I dialed my father's number again. Just once. Straight to voicemail. I left no message. The silence no longer stung. It only confirmed what I already knew: he'd chosen absence over recognition. But the Navy, the men and women I led, they chose me. By the time I hit captain, I had earned a unit that followed me without hesitation. They didn't salute my gender, didn't salute my lineage. They saluted the officer who had dragged one of their own through fire and lived to lead another day. And every time I stood in front of them, giving orders with steady voice and steady hands, I remembered the words my father had carved into me at 10 years old. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it. So I did. I handled it. And in doing so, I became something he never could have imagined an officer forged, not by his approval, but by his silence. War teaches you to compartmentalize. You learn to fold grief into neat corners, press fear flat, and stack it in the back of your mind until it weighs less. For years, my life had been nothing but compartments missions, men under my command, the silence of my father's absence. Romance never fit anywhere in the filing system. Then came James. We met at a Pentagon task force meeting on cybersecurity, one of those gray carpet fluorescent lit rooms where caffeine was the only lifeline. He wasn't military, civilian analyst, quiet, methodical, with an eye for detail sharp enough to cut through brass polish. He challenged my reporting format during a briefing, said it was inefficient. Most men either avoided me or tried to bulldoze. He did neither. I told him efficiency wasn't always speed. Sometimes it was clarity. He didn't argue. He stayed up all night reworking his entire presentation line by line into my format. The next morning, he handed me the slides and said, "You were right." Then he smiled. A real smile, not the forced kind people wear in uniform. That was the beginning. James wasn't impressed by ribbons or stars. He didn't flinch when I got called away at 2 a.m. or when I returned home smelling of jet fuel and exhaustion. He never asked me to explain the things I couldn't. Instead, he asked about the things no one else ever had. How do you stay calm under chaos? What did it feel like the first time someone called you Admiral? Most people love parts of you. James loved all of me, the steel, the scars, the silence I carried like a second uniform. When he proposed, it wasn't with fireworks or some grand spectacle. No skywriting, no diamond flashing in a crowd. It was just the two of us sitting on a pier at sunset boots, dangling over water, the smell of salt thick in the air. He opened a small box simple gold band inside and said, "Let me serve beside you wherever that means." I didn't cry, I just said yes. Planning the wedding was delicate. Neither of us wanted a circus. He hated pomp. I despised frills. The courthouse would have been enough, but my team, those SEALs who had followed me through fire and back, insisted on more. Said they wouldn't let me walk down any aisle alone. So we chose the Naval Chapel. Simple, formal. No bridesmaids, no lace, no distractions. James would wear a navy suit. I would wear my dress whites. Some people raised eyebrows at that choice. Brides wore gowns, not uniforms. But James didn't want me in anything else. He told me once, "You in uniform is the most honest thing I've ever seen." Why would I ask for less? That's when I knew the white fabric wasn't just cloth. It was my truth, my life, every scar, every decision, every silent sacrifice stitched into the seams. The night before the ceremony, James stayed with a friend. Tradition, he called it. I stayed on base alone with my thoughts. I laid out my uniform on the bed, ironed each crease, slow and reverent brass gleaming like captured sunlight. As I pressed the epaulets, my eyes blurred. 4 stars. I'd worn them into combat briefings, onto decks at dawn, through funerals. Tomorrow, I'd wear them for love. At midnight, I whispered a prayer, not for my father to show, not for his approval, just for strength. Strength to walk that aisle with no apologies. Strength to let love weigh heavier than silence. By morning, the chapel filled. SEALs arrived uninvited, shoulder to shoulder in formation. Men I hadn't seen in years. Men I'd trained, commanded, dragged out of wreckage. They came because they said it wasn't optional. Not for me. I should have been nervous. I wasn't. I'd stood under mortar fire in foreign deserts, commanded operations where one wrong call meant death. This was different. This was simple. A vow not to the Navy, not to the country, but to someone who finally saw me whole. Still, as I stood behind the chapel doors, the phone buzzed. My heart knew before my eyes did. The name wasn't saved, but I didn't need it. Dad. The text was short, sharp. "Take off that uniform. You're embarrassing us." He didn't say congratulations. He didn't say good luck. He said embarrassing. That was his gift. And I knew as the organ stirred and my escort straightened beside me that my gift back to him would be simple, to walk down that aisle anyway. In white, in truth, in uniform. The chapel was hushed when the organ began its low, steady rumble. Outside, gulls wheeled in the sharp morning light, their cries muffled by the heavy oak doors that separated me from the aisle. My hands were steady at my sides, gloves crisp against the brass buttons of my whites. The phone in my pocket still carried my father's words like shrapnel lodged too deep to pull free. "Take off that uniform. You're embarrassing us." Torres adjusted his crutch beside me, jaw tight. Marcus Hill leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed ahead, as if daring anyone on the other side to question why I wore 4 stars on my shoulders. Both men had stood with me through fire. Today, they stood with me into something more fragile, love. The chaplain's voice, muffled through the doors, began the opening blessing. My heart didn't race. It settled. a deep calm, the kind I used to find in briefing rooms just before chaos. Then the doors opened. Light burst in, refracted through stained glass into splinters of ruby and sapphire across the polished floor. The air smelled of wax and salt, faint incense rising from the altar. Rows of men in uniform turned as one, the pews a sea of shoulders, squared ribbons glinting. James stood at the front in a navy suit, simple but precise. His stance was familiar hands. Behind his back feet, shoulder-width apart, as if he had rehearsed being at ease just for me. His eyes met mine, steady shining, not with pity, but with pride. My heels struck the floor with sharp rhythm. Each step carried the weight of years' Annapolis drills, jungle mud, desert dust blood that wasn't always my own. And then, from the front row, a voice boomed, steady, commanding, a voice that once had echoed across battlefields. "Admiral, on deck." The words ricocheted through the chapel like gunfire. 200 SEALs rose in unison. The sound of boots striking wood thundered against the walls, reverent and fierce. Hands snapped to brows in perfect symmetry. The air trembled with the echo, with the weight of recognition no blood had ever given me. I kept walking. My throat tightened, not from sadness, but from honor. Every face I passed was carved from memory, men I'd trained until their legs shook. Men I'd pulled from wreckage, men who had stood beside me when silence from home threatened to hollow me out. They weren't saluting the rank. They were saluting a life lived in the uniform my father wanted stripped from me. James's smile widened as I approached. His hands twitched once, then stilled, still folded neatly. He was already standing at ease, already waiting. Behind me, Torres tapped his crutch once more. Hill shifted his weight and the organ swelled. My vision blurred, but my steps did not falter. I carried not just the weight of medals and stars, but the invisible weight of rejection turned into resolve. When I reached the front, I turned just slightly enough to see the rows upon rows of warriors still standing, salutes unwavering, a tide of steel unbroken. For one sharp second, I thought of the man not there. My father. A colonel who had led men into war, who had taught me silence instead of love. He wasn't in the pews. He wasn't among the salutes. He was just a text in my pocket, a ghost who had chosen absence over presence. The words surfaced again. "Take off that uniform." But the truth stood taller, louder, undeniable. 200 SEALs saluted. Blood didn't salute. The sound of 200 SEALs rising to their feet still echoed in my bones when the vows were spoken. Our words were simple, stripped of theatrics, like the lives we'd lived. James vowed not just to love me, but to serve beside me, to shoulder the weight instead of asking me to set it down. I promised him no lace, no veil, no disguise. Only truth in and out of uniform. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the room did not erupt with noise. Instead, it fell into a silence so heavy it felt sacred. Then the applause began, thunderous rolling, not for a performance, but for a recognition earned the hard way. We walked out beneath an arch of crossed sabers' blades, catching the sunlight lifted not by officers, but by enlisted men who had chosen the gesture themselves. It meant more that way. The reception was modest on base. No champagne fountains, no choreographed first dance, just long tables of mess hall food, folding chairs, and the hum of laughter that came only from men who had faced death together. My SEALs told stories the kind that left out gore, but carried weight. One recounted how I dragged him 40 yards through sand and bullets in Somalia, grinning through pain. Another spoke of a night in Syria when I ordered a withdrawal just in time, saving a squad from an ambush. At one point, a massive SEAL with tattooed forearms and eyes like granite approached me. He rarely spoke more than a handful of words in the field. That day, he looked down at my boots, then up at me and said, "We never stood for you because of your rank, ma'am. We stood because you never made us feel small." He hugged me, then arms like iron bands. I wasn't used to being embraced like that outside a battlefield, but I let him. Not because I needed comfort, but because I had earned it. Later, after the cake was cut and the toast faded, I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the moon a silver coin pinned against a velvet sky. James followed, folding his hands behind his back, a mirror of the way he'd stood waiting for me earlier. "Did he come?" His voice was careful, like a hand brushing over scar tissue. I hesitated, then nodded. He was there. James's brow furrowed. Inside. "No." I pulled out my phone, showing him the message again. But someone sent me a picture. He stood in the parking lot, full dress uniform, arms crossed. He never entered. James was quiet for a long moment, his breath clouding in the cool air. Finally, he said, "He came," but he still couldn't stand. The words landed heavier than the text itself. My father had chosen distance over redemption. He had watched the world rise to salute me, and he had turned away. Days later, back at my desk, another message arrived, not from him, but from the Pentagon. They wanted me to deliver a keynote on leadership at a closed-door event. Ethics in command, legacy, responsibility. I almost declined. I didn't want another stage, another spotlight, but then I remembered a sailor's suicide years ago. His file had held a single note, "Tell Admiral Holstead thank you. She's the only one who ever saw me." I had wept alone in my office that night, ribbons scattered on the floor. So I said yes. The evening of the speech, I stood in full uniform under unforgiving lights, a room filled with brass ribbons, politicians, and power. I told them stories not of myself, but of men and women who had followed me into fire, not because they were ordered to, but because they trusted the voice giving the order. I spoke of reform not as a threat, but as a duty. I closed with one truth. Respect isn't inherited. It isn't given by blood. It's earned by showing up, standing tall, and doing right even when no one is watching. There was silence, then a standing ovation. When I returned to my office the next morning, a letter sat on my desk. No return address, but the handwriting was one I had memorized as a child. Inside 5 words stared back, "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The rest of the letter was hesitant, clumsy. He admitted he hadn't saluted, not because I hadn't earned it, but because he no longer knew how to honor what he didn't understand. He asked, no pleaded for a chance to talk. Not as a colonel, not as a critic, just as a father trying to know the daughter he'd spent a lifetime refusing. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it. I just sat there, feeling the weight of decades pressing in. Blood hadn't saluted, but maybe finally blood was reaching. I agreed to meet him at Arlington. It felt fitting, not at a kitchen table, not in some quiet diner, but among the rows of stone and sacrifice, where silence carried weight, and every salute meant something. The morning was cool, the sky washed pale blue above the endless lines of white headstones. I walked in full uniform, not to prove a point, but because it was who I was. My boots struck the gravel path with steady rhythm, until I saw him older, now smaller, the iron edges softened by time. He stood by my mother's grave, slacks and jacket instead of medals and bars. His posture was rigid, but his hands trembled. When he turned for the first time in decades, I saw not the colonel who had raised me, but a man who had lost too much to his own silence. "You look like her," he said, his voice cracked. "When you stand like that." We talked not of wars or medals, not of Annapolis or battles he'd ignored, but of grief, of regret, of how silence had been his armor and his prison. He admitted he had watched from the parking lot, that day arms crossed, too proud and too afraid to walk inside. Then slowly, awkwardly, he stepped back. His spine straightened, shoulders squared. And with a deliberate motion, he raised his hand to his brow. Not crisp, not perfect, but real. I returned it, not because forgiveness was earned, but because truth had finally been chosen. That night, lying beside James, I whispered. He saluted. James didn't ask what it meant. He just held my hand until sleep came. Months later, the Pentagon called again, this time, offering me oversight of a joint operations initiative. Legacy work. Integration of ethical leadership into training. I accepted not for the brass, but for the young officers who needed to know that silence did not define them. At one base, a name caught my eye on a roster: Corporal Avery Patterson. The little girl named after the sailor I dragged from fire was grown now, boots on her feet, carrying her own flag forward. When she told me she enlisted because of her father's stories, because of me, I felt the circle close. Legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you build. 1 year to the day after my wedding, I stood on a stage to receive the Department of Defense's Excellence in Ethical Command Award. James sat in the front row, and so did my father. When the cadets in white rose to salute, I caught sight of him in the corner. This time, his hand went to his brow. The ovation rolled through the hall, but all I felt was the quiet weight of his gesture. Imperfect, late, yet finally undeniably real. Later that night, I sat with James under the stars. My phone buzzed with a message from an old SEAL. "Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am?" Blood didn't salute, but we did. I stared at it for a long time, then typed back, "Some gifts can't be returned, but some salutes stay with you forever." Because revenge isn't always destruction. Sometimes the most powerful reckoning is recognition. Sometimes the silence breaks not with words, but with a single salute. And in the end, that was enough. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect. Who stood for you when others didn't? When did you rise above what was meant to break you? Share your thoughts below, and if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience, truth, and quiet triumph, please subscribe. Together we rise.